Alec and I were among the legions covering China in what you referred to as the glorious teens and aughts. You were there from 2008 when you graduated
through to 2022.
And there was a wonderful line in the book that I don't remember about, that all the journalists were hanging on, like, what was it, the fleas on the back of the rising Promethean of China. We were there in years, the sort of the glory years.
It was an exciting time.
Yeah, running around. And I left in 2014. You stayed on, and then wrote a wonderful book, Wish Lanterns, about young Chinese, and then fled to Dali. And I guess you might as well just start by telling us what happened.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind introduction, Barbara and Orville. Great to see everyone here, including some familiar faces. Great to be in New York, which I was considering the other day as sort of the anti-Dali. But has a lot of things going for it. It's nice to feel that spring is finally arriving in New York. The book begins and ends with spring. It tells the story of 1 year in Dali, according to the Chinese lunar calendar, so beginning and ending with Spring Festival. And the cycling of the seasons is a theme in the year and in our lives. So it's nice to feel that the cycle continues here, even though I've left. Yeah. So I'm just going to do a sort of quick introduction to the book. Books are such a non-visual medium, or at least literally, that it's always pleasing for an author to just show some photos. So I've lined up a few pictures, and I'm just going to zoom through some of these to give a feel for what's inside the covers, and then we can all talk about it. So the mountains are high is the first half of a Chinese proverb, 山高皇帝远, sometimes 天高皇帝远, which means the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, and so that speaks to escape from the polis and from politics, and that really was the theme that attracted me in this particular mountain valley of Dali, where people are going to escape. They're escaping the cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and they are moving there to find a different way of being, alternative lifestyles, refuge, the simple life. So the valley is in Yunnan province, which for those not familiar is in the southwest of China. It's a hop and a skip from the border with Laos. It's a little ways from political Tibet, very close to ethnic Tibet. It's an alpine valley, 2,000 meters high, with a mountain range that extends up to 4,000 meters. Sorry, I'm very metric. I'm not sure what that is in feet. As you can see, there's a lake in the middle of it, Arhai, supposedly named for its homophone with an ear, which is what it looks a little bit like. Towards the left is the mountain range, the Tangshan Mountains, which literally means green or verdant mountains. Anyone who has learnt Chinese knows that they can't quite make their mind up what word is green or blue. There's a whole bunch of them, but more or less green mountains. There's an old town which has become somewhat of a tourist destination, a lower and an upper pass. And then all these villages dotted around, and it was one of those villages that I lived in. That's the mountain. I took that picture last autumn. It was the last sunset before I left. You can see the 3 pagodas, which were built in the 9th century by monk kings of a previous sort of dynasty adjacent to China. And then there's farmland in between the settlements and the lake. That's a little bit of island. I always love the clouds of Yunnan. It literally means south of the clouds, and I find them transcendental. That's my home, where I lived for 3 years, which coincided with the pandemic, 2020 to 23. It's a nice little home. They call them Bainian Mufang, sort of 100 years old stone and wooden homes. There are some fading inscriptions from the Cultural Revolution, which we never managed to fully decipher something about building a healthy nation. Nice big home, courtyard, vegetable patch. Rent was $2,500 a year, but it's okay. New York is good too. I like New York. Village temples are dotted around. Dali, the valley is populated by the ethnicity called the Baizu. They have various syncretic religions, including sort of worshipping of deified historical figures, so including this chap, and their own festivals, such as Torch Festival, originally a Yizu festival, and that's the Buddhist temple just around the corner from my home. Lots of weddings, lots of things to go to. That's my neighbor, Li Guanyu, who's in the book, coming back down from the mountain with some thatch. But the reason that I really went there wasn't so much for the local character. It's because people like me, and also Chinese people from all over the nation have been moving there. So it's almost somewhat an equivalent, doesn't map exactly an equivalent to upstate New York or a Londoner's cottage in Tuscany, but a place of escape, a back to the land, and this really is China's sort of back to the land movement. And it interested me that after 40 years of breakneck urbanization, China is having its own back to the land movement, and people are reevaluating priorities and moving away from the cities back to the country in a sort of reverse flow of migration over the last 40 years of urbanization. And so these are my neighbors, Zhong and Lily. You can see that their courtyard has been renovated. It's a little bit bougie, a little bit bohemian, sharing a meal. Typical Dali story. Lily is a digital nomad with remote work, promoting race car events. Zhong was a day trader from Chongqing who went bankrupt and then reinvented himself as a sort of hippie aromatherapist. And this is what we do in Dali. We sit around all day in each other's courtyards, drinking tea and having meals and sort of living the good life. It does have a hippie flavor. As you can see, there are some foreigners as well. In a fire circle in the evening, someone always pulls out the didgeridoo. That place is called the Om Cave. Nutshell, he's in the book. So I weave these stories together with the characters here. It's really centered around the place, as well as the people who have moved there. So Nutshell grew up in northern China, Shanxi province, and he worked for many years in state propaganda, editing videos, extolling the virtues of the Communist Party and its achievements. And he wasn't happy. He lived life on the conveyor belt, got married, bought a flat, and then one morning talked to his wife, sold the flat, sold everything in the flat, took his 7-year-old daughter, put the whole family in a car, drove down to Dali, and they put all of their money into building a B&B in Dali and returning to his passion of painting. And it was a very common story. I heard that time and time again. I think I met people from every province in China who had moved to Dali because they were disillusioned, I think, with some of the promises of the city, some of the promises of economic development, and perhaps pursuing personal development instead. Part of the reason Nutshell moved to Dali was for his daughter. There's a lot of alternative education schools. They wanted to get out of the state system. This is one of those alternative schools where they have sort of outdoor events and parties and so on. Here they learn maths by counting the heads of Borzai, the pak choi, and then picking some for lunch and then doing subtraction practice as well. That's Wang Xiaoye, who runs the school, and me channeling my inner hippie. Tao there has some chickens, sort of chicken eggs, fresh from the chicken, and his log cabin, which he built himself. There's a strong environmentalist streak for people who end up in Dali, sometimes a survivalist streak, a large sort of anti-pesticide culture. Perhaps unsurprisingly, people want to get back to nature. It attracts some kind of eccentric characters. This one is called Dream Hermit. He literally lives on the top of a mountain in a farmhouse, which was once an orchard, and he teaches lucid dreaming, which is where you become aware that you're dreaming, and then you can control it, which is a lot of fun, and I recommend for everyone. And he has students who come to him. One of his students is a stock trader who wants to kind of get an advantage on the market by kind of playing stocks in his dreams, and he's enjoying his breakfast there. Spirituality is a big draw. There's been a bit of a resurgence of religion in China lately. Ian Johnson wrote a great book about this called The Souls of China. And a lot of people convene on Dali to discover spirituality or to explore it. I met all sorts, Sufis, Zoroastrians, Christians, Baha'i, a group who worship the god of tea. Most of them are Buddhist, and this is a monastery on Chicken Foot Mountain near to Dali, which is a Buddhist holy mountain, where I spent a fair amount of time. And Ruchang here, he ran a bar in Beijing and Dali for many years, kind of had a crazy time. I think at his wedding he gave LSD to all of the guests. And then he woke up one morning and realized he wasn't happy and became a monk. Had to divorce his wife. She wasn't very happy about that. But 2 years later, she became a nun, and now she's just, 200 meters down the slope. There he is. That's Ruchang. You can't really see this here. It's just from my last trip. This is a weight loss camp called Dalifornia. Dalifornia. And the D of the English here is a sort of a corpulent person, and the A is a sort of a muscly, svelte guy. So yeah, a lot of people go to Dali to reinvent themselves. Interestingly, it's attracted a lot of digital nomads, a sort of tech crowd, Web3 crowd, a lot of crypto bros in Dali, which is quite the shift from what it was in the 90s when it was all people who went for the local herbs that grew on the mountainside. This is a hackathon in a co-working space of digital nomads, but I think there's a connection between those two. I think it's the two sides of a sort of anarchistic impulse, and Dali provides a sort of escape hatch, really, a mouse hole for people who want to go off the grid in all ways. So digital nomads, here's a coffee nomad busking on the street on his way to Tibet. Some go for these psychedelic raves that pop up in the mountains. Most just go for the simple life. Here's Joel Alsher, teacher Joe, a retiree, ushering in spring with a meal on the spring equinox, freshly retired in my village, just a couple of doors away, living the good life. And behind it all is the mountain. Here is a shrine to the mountain god and my dog Moon, who I miss terribly. And there it is. The mountains are high. That's 4,000 meters. That's the ridge line when I finally walked it. So that's a very sort of whistle-stop visual tour.
It's really a wonderful book, and one of the things that makes it wonderful is just the writing and the description. And I've known Alex lately since probably 2008, and I didn't know till I got 3/4 through the book that he drops reference to teaching poetry, and this book is really beautifully written. So maybe you want to read an excerpt?
Sure, I could do I think we thought just a very little bit at the start, teaser.
Just some of the descriptive writing really struck me.
Don't oversell me.
This guy is not another journalist hack. He's a poet.
I got the Barbara Demick thumb of approval. That's...
Yeah, I didn't put that in the blurb. Not another hack, but I thought
I'll take it. Okay, this is the very opening. The mountains rose in folds above me, forested contours fading from deep greens to distant pastels. At their foot sat a squat crimson temple, the character for Buddha flaking off its facade. A weathered granny in an indigo apron filled a can with spring water that flowed down the hills. Incense lingered in the air from the temple's smouldering brazier, mixing with the faint scent of rotting garbage that villagers had dumped next to the mountain trailhead. Tracing that path to the top, I would stand at the ridge of the Tangshan Massif, 4,000 meters high and cloud-shrouded, its 19 peaks stretching to the horizon like stegosaur spines, the forest falling beneath me, thick with pine and spruce. Below it all, a huge lake, shaped like a titan's ear that had fallen from the firmament. The old town by its shore, watched over by 3 pagodas built by monk kings in the 9th century. This was the valley of Dali, in China's rural southwest. I had come here to escape the city, the ruts of a life left behind. Here I would meet the other urban transplants too, each seeking their own Shangri-La. The hippies and yuppies, bohemians and bourgeois, environmentalists and survivalists, homeschoolers and retirees, Taoists and Buddhists, psychonauts and unaeronauts, dissidents and dropouts. Refugees of modernity, opting out of China's honking high-rises to live far from the nexus, trying to be free in an unfree country. As the saying went, the mountains are high and the emperor far away. That is what brought me to the mountains, to the temple, to the village that would be my home for this year of changes. By day, sunshine-pierced clouds that rolled off the peaks in waves. At night, moonlight limned the dark clinker mountains with a pale cast, swallowed them in silence. What would I find at the top? I began to climb.
Lovely. So, Alec, we have determined, and we can see the picture, that the mountains are indeed high. How far away is the emperor? And, I wondered when I read about these amazing people doing, somewhat, irregular things, not living the normal Chinese life, unusual lifestyles. I think that's something frowned upon by the Chinese government. I mean, to what extent are they tolerated? Did you feel any encroachment?
Well, the mountains aren't high enough, and the emperor isn't far enough away. Xi Jinping visited Dali in 2015. That was actually for a broadly positive purpose. It was to help clean up the environment of the lake, which was getting a lot of algae blossom. But essentially, sort of the eye of the central authorities has very much landed on Yunnan, which wasn't always the case. I've talked to various people who were there in previous eras, where you could smoke weed on the street, for example, which is what a lot of people went to Dali for, and nothing would happen because it was far enough away and no one cared. And then it's really in the last 10 years, as you know, and a lot of us know, that there's been a campaign to crack down on some of the fringes of China, both geographically and socially, and standardization campaigns. And of course, the forces of gentrification and capitalism are as much at play here, if not more, than the forces of a socialist government or a one-party state. So it's absolutely changing. It's popular. Dali is trendy now. Last spring there was a TV show, 有风的地方, with the actress who played Mulan, Liu Weifeng, and Dali became very kind of hot, and everyone descended there and wanted to sort of pursue this dream of having their own courtyard and so on. So it's changing, as all of China is. And in answer to the question on the sort of alternative lifestyles, I think it's more difficult to do that. Some of the more sort of alternative sorts kind of have been pushed further out into the hills, further out, now that Dali's on the map. I think, or I like to think that especially in a country like China, there is a need for escape hatches, for siphon valves, where people who don't want to just sort of sign up for the city dream are going. We've seen a lot of dissatisfaction with that recently, with the phenomena of tongue-ping and lying flat and so on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this. Like, what does this reflect about China? There have been many articles in the last few years, using these buzzwords: involution, neizhuang, tongue-ping, lying flat. This generation who have dropped out of the Chinese rat race. A lot of youth unemployment and a lot of voluntary unemployment. I mean, do you see that as connected to the Dali phenomenon? People who just don't want to compete.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. They're called Dali, the capital of lying flat. When I first came to China, it was 2007-8, and that was just such an exciting time when everyone wanted to get to the cities, and there was this promise. And I think you and certainly Orville has seen China in previous iterations, but at that moment in history, it felt like it was one of the sort of peaks of the urban dream, the dream of economic development transforming individual lives. And in my first book, I wrote about Chinese millennials who are really pursuing that dream, and I was writing about people who were leaving the countryside of Anhui or wherever to get to Beijing to make it. So I found it fascinating that just 10 years later, really, there had been an inversion of some of the flow, and very much a minority, which we're talking about, but a significant minority are now leaving the cities, and I think a more significant minority are dissatisfied with this promise, again, of capitalism as much as the communist state, that they are burnt out, they are overworked, and they don't see social mobility as something that they can get. This is especially young people, and a lot of them have sort of signed out and want to opt out of that false promise. And I think we see it all around the world, but in its particular form in China, where a lot of the changes that have happened to the world have been so compressed in the last 40, 50 years. It's almost as if China has gone through the last 250 years of Western sort of history from the Industrial Revolution on. And in the space of 2 generations or 3 generations of the family has gone from sort of agrarian society to post-industrial malaise. One of the my friends from Beijing who first moved to Dali and put me onto the place, he was the first to go to university. His grandparents were subsistence farmers. His parents grew up in the countryside, and they didn't know what he was doing to go back and have a vegetable patch of his own after working in the city. So it's really been compressed, and it just interested me that China's got to this point after all this breakneck growth where I felt a lot of people have been asking, okay, we're rich now as a nation, but are we happy? We've had all of this economic development. What about personal development? What about other goals? What do we do now? What do we really value in life? And I think we've all been asking that question.
A lot of this is a memoir, and you talk about yourself. When you moved to Dali, you were burnt out, going through some romantic heartbreak, kind of running away yourself. Did you feel like you were one of the same of the Chinese people you met, or did you feel that you were very different? Did you see a commonality in your reasons to go to Dali? And of course, if you wanted to smoke marijuana on the street, you could do it in New York, but not that you would do such a thing. But why, for you, was it the same phenomenon?
Obviously, I'm very different, and I think that it goes without saying, and it inflects the writing, and I think it's almost sort of once you get past that and acknowledge that the difference of privilege and background and everything, I really feel that the same things that drove me to Dali were, I found in conversation, the same things which were driving other people from their different backgrounds and stories. And so, originally I didn't intend this book to be a memoir at all. I was just interested in the topic, and then I ended up going to Dali as much for sort of personal circumstances and need for a bit of a refuge. And it happened to coincide with a pandemic as well. So it was a very pleasant place to sort of wait it out. I must admit, just kind of had the mountain right there, and no real cases or anything. So I did find, as I was talking to my neighbours who were the new migrants, the reverse migrants there, as well as many foreigners who moved there after being burnt out in Chinese cities, that I was on the same path. And I found, I think, a more universal human drive underneath these things, which extends far beyond just the particularities of China. And so I did draw that out. And in the end, it's sort of those two strands are woven in the book with the neighbours' stories and my own.
At what point did you decide to write a book? Was that,
From very early, very early. And Dali had always been a topic that interested me, and I'd visited a bunch of times before, from starting in 2016, or my first time was 2009. So it was always in the back of my mind, and these things, I think, weave together.
So you were not exactly lying flat.
Well, should have seen me on a Sunday morning.
But you did a lot of different things. There was the gardening, there was the yoga, the lucid dreaming. I mean, what helped you? And I'm particularly interested in the lucid dreaming. And this guy was like, running a school to teach you how to control your dreams, and I think he had a whole business.
Yeah, you can go. He has a website, 68m.com. His volunteers run it. You can follow his WeChat channel. There's lots of tips. There are all of these different strands and paths that people were pursuing, I think, to find just a different way, or a way to be happier, or have some sort of mental serenity. Some of them explored through dreams. Some of them explored it through meditation was a big thing, self-cultivation, spirituality, I think, helps a lot. Some of them through gardening, and living close to nature. It had a strong outdoorsy culture. And I think through all of these different paths, I think people were pursuing the same goal, which, kind of halfway through writing the book, I realized it was about seeking freedom, in all of its definitions, and of which political freedom, I think, gets the most attention, but is often the least important. Or certainly in a country where you don't have it, other forms of freedom become, I think, more important. Personal and mental and financial, certainly. And that means different people, different things for different people from different backgrounds. The locals in the valley are all trying to earn enough to leave. But for the sliver of the population who moved there, which by and large is a privileged sliver, which is more what I could relate to, those city people moving there, I think that's what they sought through different means.
And do you think they found freedom? And also, I'm curious about some of these privileged people looking for freedom. Do you think that they were the type of people who really wanted to leave China altogether, and this was the sort of first step to departure?
Yeah, I should probably kind of qualify privileged, because a lot of them weren't. A lot of them came there with absolutely nothing. Kind of dropouts, really, and I think found that money you didn't necessarily need to feel free. What was the question?
Well, you said they were not necessarily seeking political freedom, but do you think that for some of them this was like a first step to leaving China, dropping out of society, looking for something else?
So there's this other phenomenon, running away from China, which I think is connected to lying flat and to involution and these other words, where there's a dissatisfaction, not just with the lives that they were leading, but with China specifically, and that was happening at the same time. And over the 12 years that I was in China, I think I saw it from that zenith, really, of 2008, where China had an active civil society, and there was a lot of things happening. I moved there because I thought there was going to be a color revolution, and I was 22, and then 15 years later, it very much went the other way, the other direction, which it absolutely didn't need to be the case. And a lot of the people who either fled to places like Dali or are fleeing China altogether, I think, feel that disillusionment with the general political direction, and just sort of the space has been shrinking for doing interesting things. And Dali is a sort of place where those who aren't able to leave the country try to find some sort of escape within it.
Could you talk about some of the personalities in this book? They all have great names. There's like Pigeon and Lemon and Nutmeg. I don't know if they use these names or you nicknamed them, but they're quite
some of them are
evocative.
to protect the sources, but almost everyone I met had a Dali name that they gave themselves, like a Nutshell. That's not his real name. Pigeon certainly isn't. A sort of a new nickname to signify a kind of a new identity. And so through the seasons, the book is just the first year of living Dali and meeting these people. I sort of weave those stories from the bar owner turned into a monk, to the lucid dreamer, to various sort of farm owners and sort of alternative school teachers, to all of the neighbours and people around me. There's lots of.
Yeah. Are there lessons for us from this? Those of us who live in New York, is there a way we can find our own hermitage in New York? Just yoga, meditation.
Well, you'll have to buy the book, which is available at the back there, to find that out. But I just recently learnt this quote. What is it? 那个大隐隐于野，小隐隐于市。No, 小隐隐于野，大隐隐于市. The inferior hermit is a hermit in the wild. The superior hermit is a hermit in the city, which I thought was just perfect, especially having moved from Dali to here in New York, which is sort of the opposite. It's very materialistic and sort of status conscious and expensive, and kind of finding that I'm working on it. I'm very much the inferior hermit, but I'm working on finding that in a piece. And I think.
Okay. Thanks for the advice. He's going to teach me about lucid dreaming later.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this up to.
We'll continue in our dreams.
Yeah. I'll think of the questions. Okay. Hang on. And if you don't mind, if you're willing to introduce yourself, say who you are.
I'm Ariana King, and I work at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia. I'm curious about how the locals and the newcomers coexisted with each other. Here we would maybe use the word gentrification. I wonder if there was any sense of that. Yeah,
absolutely. Let me just take a sip of my wine glass tea. The valley is changing from these commercial forces, with people moving in. Not all of the proceeds going back to the locals. Some of them, there's more work in construction and so on. But the complaint I heard most from locals is that the prices are being driven up with not enough going into their pockets, which is, such a familiar story. And I feel like it's been playing out in other sort of rural escapes, including in America, where during the pandemic, I think a lot of city people with remote work descended on these places and priced out the locals. And that is happening to a degree. There's a bit of a property boom happening in Dali. And I'm not sure that the locals are seeing the rewards of that. At the same time, it's a place which is, driven by a tourism industry, among other things. So it's a complicated interaction. The valley has such an interesting history of outside influence weaving with the locals. It's really a migrant valley at heart, and has been for millennia. But the relationship between locals and outsiders, I would say, generally very friendly but complicated aspects to it, which I explored just a little bit.
Thank you. I enjoy you reading. You read a few first page. I think it's beautifully written. And funny you mentioned Shangri-La. No, I visited Dali 18 years ago. There's really a Shangri-La hotel there. So, and my question is, like in China, Yangshuo is another place people like to go to, to just hang out and Tangping. Are there other places except Dali, Yangshuo? And how long would most people stay there? They're all their life or just temporarily for a few years and then move on to some other places? Thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of places that people go. I mean, there's an actual Shangri-La, as I'm sure you know, just 300 kilometers north of Dali, which was renamed in 2001 to Shangri-La. And a lot of escapees with a similar urge to those who end up in Dali might end up in Yangshuo, or the countryside around Chengdu is very popular. There's lots of communes which are popping up, intentional communities. There's one on the outskirts of Guangzhou, which is just a village in sight of skyscrapers. There's one in Fujian called Another Land, which is halfway up a mountain. And people are sort of finding these little sort of escape holes and something to go to. So yeah, but a lot of them are sort of popping up, I think, to fulfill a need.
I think you mentioned in the book a couple who moved to Dali, and they were blogging and the whole thing, their escape to the countryside, and they stayed about a year.
Yeah.
And went back.
Yes, exactly. And to the second half of the question, it was so common for people to go and rent a house for 20 years and think this is going to be my forever home, and then you're at their leaving party a couple of years later. Perhaps because the Shangri-Las that we seek are illusory, or we think that a geographical change is going to foster an inner change, and then get delusioned with that itself, and the cycle continues. So, yeah.
Hi, Isaac Stonefish. Hey, Alec.
Hi.
How did they feel about Brits and Americans when you were there, and how did that evolve over the years that you were there?
Specifically, Brits and Americans.
Pick your foreigner.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel like Chinese attitudes towards me is dependent on whatever Boris Johnson has just done or something. That was certainly the case for Americans for a stretch in the middle there. I remember meeting a fire ranger up the mountain who gave me a big old lecture about the colonial legacy, which I had to swallow, but very willingly. It's as you know yourself, or anyone who's lived in China a long time, it's when you're there as a foreigner, and especially from a particular culture, you're kind of seeing the nation through the prism of how that nation is viewed or how that nation has been presented. And I find it differs from generations. I find I get sort of the most heat sometimes from an older generation who grew up with this idea of, say, America as the enemy, or Britain. I've been called a colonialist on a train. And then younger people, especially in the cities, tend to be a lot more kind of curious and open-minded. So it really varies so wildly. As you know, I mean, my favorite quote about China is from Charles de Gaulle, and he said, China is a large country full of many Chinese people. And I think he really nailed it.
Hi, Alec. I'm Amy Zhang. I actually wrote a piece about many people who have recently migrated to Thailand from Dali because they feel the encroaching sort of repression limits over the past few years. So I'm curious about the limits of the freedom that you observed, because you've shown us sort of the psychedelic raves and the lucid dreaming. But I guess I'm curious about those edges. Like, where did you see those edges push, especially during COVID? I know there was some protests. If you could describe what you observed.
Yeah, the protests Amy is referring to were nationwide, sort of popping up in various cities, a couple of hundred people here and there in November of 2023, including about a score of people, including some friends, wandering through the old town of Dali singing the Internationale, which was about as a Dali a protest as you can get. It has actually attracted quite a lot of political distance. Liao Yiwu spent some time there, who was a poet who was imprisoned after Tiananmen. In the book, I interview another Tiananmen student leader, pseudonymously, who's still there. Various distances have gone there. But there's very much a limit to what freedom you can pursue. You know, certainly in political freedoms, there's a hard limit. If you're experimenting with some subcultures which the nation frowns on, there's a hard limit, which is getting harder. And the range of what is included in those subcultures is expanding as well. So now it's almost at the point where anything in which people are organizing, including innocuous, or what I would think are innocuous sort of civil society things like environmentalism and feminism, can now become sensitive. So this is not a place where people are moving to change the nation. It's a place where people are moving to get away from the nation, to the extent that they still can, and those who can't would move to Chiang Mai, where you were writing from. But still, I think for the vast majority, these political strictures are just not so much on the radar. It's there in the background. Very much came to the foreground in 2022, when the nation went a little bit crazy with zero COVID. But for the most part, it continues to be the case. But for the majority of Chinese people, they're just living their lives the best they can. And politics, it's almost so far in the foreground, party control, that it becomes part of the background, if that makes any sense at all. It's just there. It's part of the fabric. What are you going to do about it? Go live your life. It's just not something I've found is at the front of people's minds as it is perhaps outside.
Hi, Alec. My name is Ruby. Like you, I was living and working in China during the pandemic. And I'm currently writing a book on China's health system. So I had a writing question for you. In Wish Lanterns, you made very clear you didn't want to put yourself in any of the book, and it was all about other people using their stories to describe, social and cultural phenomenon in China. Whereas in this book, you very much put yourself in the center of the story and your own experiences. So I'm just wondering, what made you decide to do that? And how do you feel in doing that? What parts of you do you share and not share? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I did go from one extreme to the other somewhat, because the word I didn't appear in Wish Lanterns until the author's note at the end, just because I wanted to foreground the stories of the people I was writing about and correctly thought that I wasn't very interesting. In this book, it was more about place than people, and I was really living it. And that's just the way it happened. So there came a point where it felt it would be dishonest not to include myself in it. I didn't, expect that to happen, but books have a life of their own, as you're finding out, and they sort of meander the ways they do when you're writing them, and you find the voice, and then you just got to have the courage to go with it. And yeah, I feel good about it. Life's too short. Just write what you will.
Thank you, Alec. 20 years ago, there was a group of people living in Dali, outsiders. But my understanding, because I come from Dali, I grew up there, my understanding is that most of them were foreigners, were people coming from outside of China. And in the past few years, 10 years, each time I went back home, it's hard to see foreigners on the streets. Most of the people coming from outside of Dali, living in Dali now, are Chinese people from big cities. Because I haven't started reading the book, but I was just wondering whether you had the chance to see a foreign community in Dali today, and who are the foreigners? How do they compare with the Chinese people you write about in this book? Thank you.
Yeah, there's definitely a foreign community. I was part of it. I had a little jazz band and an improv comedy troupe, and they're still there, as they always have been, including the time that you were there. There's a guy sitting 2 rows behind you who was there at that time. Dali has always attracted foreigners as well. In fact, there's a street running through the old town called Foreigners Street, just because there were so many backpackers who would pass through, and that's been part of the fabric for a while. It's just that recently there's been this huge influx of internal migrants from the cities, as you saw when you were back. So it's very much changed the ratio. It's no longer the sort of hidden kind of remote place which only the in-the-know people go to. Now it's very much on the map. But the drives that I was talking about have attracted people of all colors.
I'm curious, what kind of visas did they get? Because you can't really get a...
Never ask someone about their visa.
We can ask about others. Others.
We have our ways.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because it doesn't seem as easy. It doesn't seem that the Chinese government ever really wanted any part of China to become like what was, when I was younger, Prague and these different places where
there's always been that
havens.
force. There's always been that force in China to shut off. And someone recently described China to me now, a Chinese friend, as like a biguan suoguo, which means the closed country of the imperial times of the late Qing. But it very much hasn't always been that in its history. For vast swathes of its history is so opening to outsiders of its imperial history as well. The Yuan, the Ming, and in more recent decades, and in the 80s, and in the 90s, it's just reverted back to that instinct. In the pandemic, a lot of people got fed up and left. A lot of foreigners, including me, had this exodus in 2022. So there's less outsiders now, and I think it's really Xi Jinping and his instinct to lock the nation down, to make it an autarky, this sort of instinctive response. And I think it's a tragedy, because I think it didn't need to be that way. And I think China has always had, a welcoming sort of force which is fighting against that tightening force. And this is where we are now. But spring follows winter.
It's interesting what you describe about some of these people who fled to Dali. It seemed like that they weren't so much escaping the emperor as that their own parents.
Yes.
Yeah, but
aren't we all?
But yeah, they didn't want to get married. They didn't, they were embracing alternative lifestyles and sometimes alternative sexuality.
It's because it's a relatively tolerant place to go, as the cities are becoming as well in that respect, at least. But there's so much pressure, especially on young Chinese people from their parents and society to sort of conform to a certain way of living and sort of certain material goals. And I think much more so than in the West. I think it's a real difference. So I heard that time and time again from the people there, that they just wanted to be somewhere they could hang with their friends, escape that pressure, and that pressure cooker of the cities.
Yeah. But you don't see a longer term return to the countryside, giving up their urban hukou for the simpler life.
There was a retired couple who did that, very interestingly, because it's a very, very small loophole where you can actually trade an urban hukou or registration.
Everybody here knows what a
registration document to a rural one, but there was a retired lady who did exactly that. So I think people there have been finding the same shift in priorities that I think we have over the last few years as well. And while everything in China has its particularities, I think it really speaks to more universal themes.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of universal themes touched on in this book. It really is a wonderful read. Anyway, I think that's a wrap.
Or one more? Yeah.
Is there one more there? Sorry, it's hard to see with the lights.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.